está liando? ¿Qué están liando?
¿Usted quiere que lo cree? ¿Por qué se ve invertido?
Siempre se ve invertido, pero luego está bien.
Es para que te veas cómo se vería. Cómo te vería.
Lo pregunté ayer por Google. Y dice, no.
No pasa nada.
No pasa nada, que luego se vea derecho.
Es para como si te estuvieras mirando al espejo.
Sí.
Para que te veas hacer así y ya hagas así.
Sí, eso.
Y no se puede girar con la opción.
No hay opción.
Tiene que decir lo normal es que se ve invertido, pero si lo quieres ver es lo normal.
Estamos en el aire.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Could I try out the laptop,
Yes,
please?
of course. I am here.
Tengo dos conectores si hace falta.
Bueno.
Que si le hace falta los conectores tengo yo. El vídeo del Mac.
Sí. agua. Baja un poco la luz. Ahí.
La de arriba que la quite, ¿no?
Hay que cambiar la pantalla.
Dime.
Tiene que cambiar la salida para que vaya.
Porque no sale.
No.
Sí, hay que decirle que clore.
Very good, thank you. Gracias.
A ver. Lo copio y lo pego y se lo mando a Beatriz. Es que como lo he tenido que hacer aquí, porque no tenía ordenanza. Qué asco de internet este que sabes. Ojo, pues adiós. Yo tengo esto y esta, o sea, lo digo.
La vida sigue siendo
¿Puedo explicarlo?
Igual.
We will be like a student. So I can be there.
Okay. So I have to look back.
Good morning, everywhere. I hope you are enjoying your stay here in Elche. I guess most of you are still sleeping or whatever. So, but we have to go on. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce you Dr. Marc de Kamps. Marc is right now at the University of Leeds in UK, but he has been working in other universities. For instance, he was at the Technical University in Munich. He was the coordinator of a thematic network on neural system, Neuro IT. And now he's involved in many projects, for instance, the Human Brain Project. He's an expert on population density analysis. So he also is an expert in artificial intelligence and the relationship with natural system and natural computation, and is working on modeling and simulation. One of the fields of research is related with visual attention and visual search, and I'm sure we will enjoy your talk. Thank you a lot for coming to Elche and for accepting our invitation, and I hope you also enjoy your stay here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to be back in Elche. What I'm going to talk about today is population density techniques, which is a way of modeling neural populations without having to model each individual neuron in detail. And hopefully we can arrive at a kind of mesoscopic scale between biology and cognition, because on the one hand it's very interesting that you are able to simulate billions of neurons, and we will probably soon be in a position where you can. On the other hand, it's not a suitable starting point for understanding the higher level cognitive processes. And if you are interested in artificial applications, to some extent, yes, you can do them with what you learn from basic neuroscience, but with some of the more challenging and some of the more interesting capabilities of human cognition we have not really managed to implement in artificial applications. So this remains an important topic. And on top of that, we are at the threshold of really a data explosion. On the one hand, the number of publications that come from traditional neuroscience techniques, single electrode recordings, but also fMRI, EEG techniques, that by themselves is exploding. The number of publications on these topics are really massive. But there are novel ways of taking data now, which increasingly start to create first of all, new data, but second of all, they raise questions about how we're dealing with these data. So multi-electrode arrays like the Utah array, which has been pioneered and promoted by Eduardo Fernandez for a long time, for example, starts to give you data on neurons that are in a population, neurons that are not too far apart, and that are in some way intricately connected, yet we don't know how. But they do something collectively, they do it together, and we need to make sense of that. And we need to make sense of that without being able to access all the individual neural pathways, without having access to all the individual neurons together. So one interesting paper that has not been published yet is available as a preprint on arXiv, it suggests that you are now with multi-electrode arrays able to tell apart excitatory spikes from excitatory neurons and spikes from inhibitory neurons. Now that is not my claim, that is the claim of the authors, but if they write there onto something very exciting, what they have shown is that if they histogram the excitatory spikes and the inhibitory spikes, is that you see kind of balance, and you see that in the plot on the right-hand side, where over different time scales, excitatory and inhibitory neurons are plotted against each other, and where you often see that peaks in the excitatory neurons are matched by the inhibitory neurons. Now, some of you would say, okay, that is balance of excitation and inhibition, and we already have studied that for a long time, and that's true. But many of these studies have done that in a theoretical context, and this is data from humans and macaque monkeys in an awake state. In other words, you really see in humans that are otherwise normally active, that have normal brain activity. For the first time, people, at least they claim that, are able to see the balance of excitation and inhibition, where the inhibition sort of matches peak in the excitation, but is slightly delayed. This is very exciting. This takes the whole concept of balanced excitation from a theoretical construct or plaything for modelists to something that really happens in humans. And these people have also taken data from people with epileptic seizures, and what they can show is that if we take that claim as it is, that yes, there is an imbalance between excitation and inhibition that is associated with epileptic seizures, not in the way that we currently would expect. It is not the absence of inhibition. So this is very exciting work, and it sort of is the shape of things to come. This is what we will be looking at in 5 years' time, tons of data on experiments like this. And there's also another reason as to think in terms of populations rather than individual neurons. And I don't know if this is very visible in the back. It's probably not. It looks a bit hazy here. But what you see here is basically a deep learner, which is a model of the visual cortex, and it does a primitive form of object recognition. So beneath the AZ layers that purport to show the primary visual cortex, then higher areas of the visual cortex, these networks has connections which are not shown, which sort of have similar receptive field structure that you find in the visual cortex, and it's capable of object recognition. And each of these blobs here, these yellow, blue blobs, and I don't think it comes across in this, but each of these blobs is not just a node, an artificial node. It's a circuit. It is a circuit population. And even if it is hazy, what I would like to convey with this plot is that if you start to model it, or if you, for example, want to create neural networks that on the one hand are able of doing realistic object recognition to the best of our knowledge, biologically plausible, and if you want to incorporate neurodynamics in them, then the organization of such simulations and to modify them into something dynamic is already challenging enough if you don't bother with the details of the individual neurons. But if you stick to the population level, and also in the language model of language, we find it makes much more sense to model at the level of neural populations than of individual neurons. I think that if you show what we've done with this feed-forward neural network and you show it to people who look to neuroscientists of the visual cortex, they would say sort of, yeah, okay, we don't know for sure if this is what's really happening in the cortex, but it could work like this. Whereas if you would construct such a model from realistic individual neurons, like you could simulate with neurons, people would say, well, you know, we don't believe this because we have no idea that all this biological detail really somehow makes the model better. It probably doesn't. So the point I'm trying to get across is, yes, individual neurons are important, and it's very important to understand what they're doing, but it's unworkable to do either cognition in terms of individual neurons alone. And then you could argue, okay, we could use neural mass models, and indeed you could, and we have, and we've done that for many years. Neural mass models essentially is a dynamical description of population level activity, where you reduce the whole population to a single variable, where you say, okay, we model the population in terms of an average firing rate or an average membrane potential, and we have simple differential equation, and we can sort of show that this is justified. Wilson Cohen and Gerstner have done work on this that justifies this to some extent. They have been widely used in the implementation of fMRI, EEG, MEC, and other data. But many of these models are phenomenological. Are phenomenological, and in other words, they do not necessarily describe, they may describe the phenomenon that you're looking at accurately. They may describe the EEG signal accurately or the MEC signal accurately. It does not necessarily follow that the equations also describe neurons at a high level. It's not easy to identify what goes on at the neural state. Like I said, there has been some justification of neural mass models. We know that they don't do well in the description of transients. And the inclusion of biological data, so say for example that you do find that some ion channel is particularly important in some neural system. It's not always clear how to do it, and past methods have not always been properly justified. And I will later in the talk give you some examples of dynamics where it is clear that the entire state of the population matters, and where you can't reduce things to a single variable, an average firing rate. So, for the work that we want to do, we have a number of requirements. We want to be able to really model large networks. That's what you need for complex cognitive models. But we also want realistic population dynamics. We want to be able to characterize populations and connections statistically. We do not want to go to a situation where we really want to create a simulation with millions or billions of neurons, and where we have to do tons of color processing to get a little bit of understanding of what actually goes on in the simulation. At some point, you can make a simulation so complex that they are as complex as the human brain, and you still do not understand what's going on. And moreover, statistics in a way are a good way to mask your lack of knowledge. You can just as well use statistics to incorporate noise as to say something, oh, well, actually we don't know exactly what I'll describe here has manifest scaling. If you model at the population level, and most of the intrinsic hard computational work goes on at the node level, and there is relatively low bandwidth, low latency exchange of information between the nodes, then you can implement it very well on a modern high performance computer. And importantly, you can make a link to the analysis using dynamic systems theory. And I'll briefly touch on that. Important, you want to understand large dynamical stochastic systems, and that may apply to biology, possibly applies to hardware as well. So, what level are we talking about? You may or may not know that there are very sophisticated tools out there to simulate individual neurons. So if you want to simulate a particular type of neuron with all its morphology and all its ion channel details, there are fantastic tools out there like neuron imagenesis that allow you to do that. And maybe that is something you have to do in some cases. But in many cases, it's probably not necessary. And if you look at the population of, say, 1,000 neurons or more, because you're interested in how a certain brain area responds to external stimulation, then maybe the morphology of individual neurons does not matter too much, or you can treat it statistically. So, my point is that in many cases, if you really look at large populations, you can work with point model neurons. Now, point model neurons are a fairly realistic description in terms of the mechanisms of ion channels and membrane potentials, but you sacrifice a little bit on the morphology. Doesn't necessarily mean that morphology can't be included, it's not being done at the moment very much. But there is a large industry of modeling using point model neurons, and typically this is starting point that many people take for modeling populations, mainly for pragmatic reasons. Now, what is a point model neuron? I think most people have heard in this room about the lead integrated fire neuron. The lead integrated fire neuron is basically a simple model that said, okay, a neuron in a way acts like a capacitor that you can charge, and that if you leave it further alone, slowly discharges itself. And that is something, of course, that we know how to do and know how to model. And the only thing that distinguishes it really from a radio circuit is the fact that if you push the neuron above a certain threshold, then two things will happen. The neuron itself will start to emit a spike, and the neuron itself is being reset to its original potential, usually immediately, which is kind of an approximation, and then the neuron remains quiet for a brief period of time, the refractive period, and that's okay. People know how to do this, know how to do this. It's a very simple model, but it does capture some of the aspects of real neurons. If you say, well, that's not good enough for me, you can go into more sophisticated conductance-based models, like Hodgkin and Huxley, which give a very good account of the ion channel activity involved. But they are complex to understand, they have complex dynamics, and they're four-dimensional, and why that is relevant, I will explain later in the talk, why that is not necessarily a problem, but something to be looked at. What you see nowadays, because these conductance-based models are complexes, is a trend towards effective models. So programmatically integrated fire neurons are a model that is very suitable if you want to have a model with proper spikes, not a spike bolted on top of it, like in the integrated fire neuron. And an adaptive exponential integrated fire neuron is something which has both a membrane potential and a parameter that accounts for the adaptation. And this model has been extensively fitted to experimental data to the point where you can use it to generate spike trains that match those of experimental data quite well. And the idea is that maybe you do not need to model each individual conductance very accurately if you're interested in certain questions. Maybe instead of 4D state space, you can deal with the 2D state space. And although you've taken some shortcuts, maybe that is still a very good description of the data. Let's look at point model. Let's look at the lead integrated fire neuron, like I said, is probably well known. What you see is that if you leave the neuron alone and it has a membrane potential of its own, then it will leak away that membrane potential, or if you charge it externally, it will charge up. And the programmatically integrated fire neuron basically is a model that is a phenomenological extension of that, and in some ways is about the model of what a real neuron does. But when I talk about neuron models, basically you say a neuron model is a curve, if you wish. A curve like this one. And what I'm going to tell about population density techniques is valid not just for linear integrated environments, it is valid for any neuron that you have this kind of curve. So what I'm trying to say to you is the population density models that I'm going to show apply to any neuron model, even a model that you haven't come up with yet, and I'll explain you later how to do this. But if you come up with an interesting 1D or 2D model that has not been invented yet, say, well, this is kind of, then you can apply these methods to, we can show it. So what is progressive integrated environment? It's maybe less well known than the progressive integrated environment. If you look at the equation, you see that there's a parabola there, and the parabola tells you how the derivative of the membrane potential behaves. So here you see that if you have a membrane potential here, that you look at the point of the curve and you see that the derivative is positive, so that there is a trend to drive the neuron towards a higher potential up to this point, which is an equilibrium point. And if you would not apply an external input, then the neural membrane potential would rest at this state. If you would elevate the neural potential slightly a little bit, and then you leave it alone, you look at the curve again, you see that the curve is negative, that it's below the x-axis, and that therefore the derivative is negative, and that there is therefore a trend to drive the membrane potential back to its equilibrium potential. And in that sense, it's exactly like a linear integrated environment. And the linear integrated environment actually is also a curve, and it's a straight line. So in a linear integrated environment, no matter how hard you push, if you raise the membrane potential, you also increase the drive back to the equilibrium point, up to the threshold where you say, okay, the neuron is now above threshold, and it has. For progressive integrated environment, you don't have to do this. If you keep pushing it and pushing it above threshold, at some point you reach a second equilibrium point, and if you push it slightly above that and leave it alone, you see that the derivative of the membrane potential is positive, and that there is a trend to drive the membrane potential even towards higher value. And at a higher value, the derivative is even larger. So what you have here is a membrane, is a mechanism for spike generation. And in that sense, the progressive integrated environment is to be preferred over the linear integrated environment, because it has all the aspects of a linear integrated environment, but it also has an angiogenesis mechanism for spiking. And in a way, it's not a bad model for a conductance-based model with a sodium channel, where you look at the spiking mechanism alone. This is just to show that, you know, you can make any model you want, basically by drawing the curves in this way. And what I'm going to talk about for linear integrated environments and quadratic integrated environments applies just as well to other models. So this is basically the idea. Here you see what I just explained in detail, sketchily in detail, the integrated environment. What you see here is the membrane potential, and on the vertical axis is the time. And if I put the membrane potential at a certain value, then over time, if the membrane potential is very negative, it will go to an equilibrium state. If it is slightly positive, it will decay back to an equilibrium state, unless I make the membrane potential very big, and then it will, at some point, very rapidly go to infinity or a very large value, and that makes one spike. So there are actually three regimes for the quadratic integrated environment. I've drawn here the parabola crossing the x-axis. You could easily imagine the parabola not crossing the x-axis. It would be above the x-axis everywhere. And then everywhere, basically, you have a spike generation. So that is what you see on the right-hand side. A neuron that would be modeled in that way would always spike. It would spike endogenously, even if you do not apply an external current to it. You put it at some value, at some point it will end up. At some point it will end up at a relatively high spike rate. Not really this. Okay, so what do you do when you model population? Well, you can say, okay, we understand these individual models, we find them simple, we just create a large number of them, we connect them in some random way. Typically, we don't know all the connections in the human population, but we often know something about the statistics, and we can simulate the statistics, and thereby we can simulate these networks. And that looks very realistic, and it can give very realistic looking spike rasters if you do it, but basically what you're doing for large enough numbers is basically you have two populations, and they're connected in certain ways that we know the statistics of. And people don't always realize it, but if you look at the simulation script of modern simulators, so for example, this is the simulation of a neural population in Brian, which is a nice simulator. You are able to specify the model neuron, which is happening in lines 3, 4, and 5 through some differential equations. And then you are able to create a neuron group. And you are able to model a neuron group. You can say, well, we have subgroup, we have connections between them with a certain sparseness and an average weight of this and an average weight of that. In other words, although people feel very much they are working with simulations of spiking neurons, and if you would draw out a simulation, you would get a very realistic looking graph of connectivity basically in doing this. And if you're doing that, then the question is, can you model the population without having to go through the simulation of thousands or 10,000s of individual neurons? And let's look at that. How would you do it? Well, if you look at the simulation of single population of the integrated fire neurons, and you switch it on, and all the neurons are at equilibrium in the beginning, and what you see is you can give an excited input of Poisson spike trains. You have a synaptic efficacy that is relatively small to the threshold, and you let the simulation go for a while. And then in the beginning, this population will not respond because all the neurons receive spikes, but they will slowly have their memory potential be pushed up to threshold level, but it will take a while before the neurons reach the threshold level. And at some point, some of them will do, and we will get a spike. And because all of these neurons will get stimulated at the same time, most of them will spike for the first time at a certain rate, not too far apart, and then you see some depletion, and then you see that each individual neuron sort of starts to spike when they forget the initial state. And what you can do is, at any point in time, you can make a histogram of the membrane potential of the population. So this is basically, if you say, well, after maybe half a second, I look at each neuron, I look at what the membrane potential is of each neuron, I make a histogram of that state, and that's histogram. And it turns out that this is a very fundamental plot. In a way, if you were to be able to simulate this histogram, you could calculate anything, any quantity that is defined in population. So this is, in a way, it's strange because I have to do quite a bit of work to extract this histogram from the simulation. But if I were able to simulate this histogram from the first instance, I would actually be able to extract the population level quantities. And how does that work? Well, that's what the talk is about. I'm going to explain how that works. But what I want to convey to you is that you actually can calculate this histogram from first principles. And the techniques that I'm discussing today allow you to do this. You are able to calculate this histogram without having to simulate thousands of neurons or 10,000 of neurons. But you are able to do it in a way that respects the neurodynamics perfectly. So what you see here is the red markers are data extracted from simulation we've done on the left-hand side. It's what we call Monte Carlo simulation, a simulation of a few thousand neurons. And if you make the histogram, you see that it follows the experimental curve within statistics very accurately. And that means that population density techniques are not just like rate-based models, or they do something like neural population. They respect neural population dynamics exactly if you have a large enough number of neurons. And that is an important difference. This is the firing rate profile that I was just talking about. So if you collect enough statistics from these spiking neurons, and if you convert it into a population firing rate, then the blue dots convert into the red markers. So what I'm doing basically is I make a histogram of the blue dots in sufficiently small time units, and that gives me the blue markers. And now it's much more visible that indeed you have quite a period at the start of the simulation, and that you have most neurons firing in concert. That most neurons fire in concert, and that you then get a period of relative quiet because most neurons just have fire, and that then at some point the neurons even out because they spike asynchronously and rapidly, and they sort of forget about the initial state. So do not be misled by the smoothness of the curve on the right hand side, which is actually calculated from this curve here. So this is what we call population density histogram. It's population density function. It tells you where in the state space neurons are at any point in time. And that is what we calculate. And from that density profile, you can calculate the firing rate. And what you see is that it matches the firing rate that comes out of the simulations of the individual neurons very accurately, perfectly within statistics. And this is for leading integrated firing. So what do we do? How do we do it? Well, as I already mentioned, neural point models are basically a curve that tells you how neurons move in state space. So the red arrows basically tells you that all my neurons are here and they want to move in the direction of the red arrow, meaning that on the left of the equilibrium point they want to move to the equilibrium point to the right, to higher potential. If they are at high potential but not too high, they want to move back to the equilibrium point. So in principle, you can calculate how neurons behave. So if you look at two bins in the membrane potential distribution, you can say, okay, we have these arrows which represent my neurodynamics. And if I look at the bin in state space, my neurodynamics tell me exactly how many neurons will move in at any point in time from other parts of state space, and also how many neurons move out due to my neurodynamics. And then I have my synaptic input. And my synaptic input does something else and do the first approximation completely independent. It knocks neurons from one part of the state space to another part of the state space. So if a neuron receives input spike and you have very fast synapses, then it's a reasonable approximation to see the neural potential go up very rapidly as a consequence of the input spike. And that basically means that you have a transfer from neuron from one being in the state space to another being in the state space. And that's even true for conductance-based models in higher dimensions. So you have these two processes that each by themselves are fairly well understood, where you can say, okay, we know how many neurons move into a certain bin in state space due to the neurodynamics. We know how many neurons move out, and we know how many neurons move in due to synaptic input from elsewhere. Thank you. And we know how many neurons move out of the bin. And you can make a balance equation of that. And that is the only balance, the only bit of mathematics I'm going to show, but you can really model this accurately. You can say, okay, I have this density function, which is basically a program of my state space. I understand my neurodynamics, which is coded in this F, in this curve, which can be any curve you want, so it does not apply to any specific neural model. And basically, the conservation probability requires that the neurons that move to a different part of state space are the same neurons that were in a different part of state space at an earlier point in time. And I'm not going to go into much detail, but if you work out the mathematics, what you get is a balance equation, which on the left-hand side, if you would put the right-hand side to 0, explains just the moving of the density due to the neurodynamics in state space. And on the right-hand side, you find something that expresses how it moves due to synaptic input. And this is a very general equation. And for people who work in this field, if you make the assumption that the synapses are small, you can make a Taylor expansion and you get a diffusion equation. And that's all I'm going to say about this kind of extension, which you would like to be able to solve these equations. And without going into the details of how we do it mathematically, what you have to do is to solve this equation. And what I'm presenting here is a tool to do so. And the nice thing about this tool is that to some extent it doesn't depend on this F, and it also does not depend on the synaptic efficacy being small. You may have heard of Fokker-Plante equations being used to model the state space. What I'm showing you today is far more general. So how does it work? Well, the nice thing is I do not even have to solve this partial differential equation. I can just be clever about it. And the way to do this is to look at this diagram, which again are linear integrated diagrams. So what you see on the left-hand side, and there's really a lot of information in this slide, what you see on the vertical axis is the membrane potential. And what it's telling you is that if I put a neuron there and I'm following through time, then these black curves tell you how the membrane potential develops over time. And that is not too difficult. You could probably make these calls yourself. And what you have to understand is that you can model a number of neurons that are in each bit, and you can follow them. So let's say that we look at the neurons that are between 0.015 and 0.020, the right-hand, the most right-hand side of it. If you follow them, and you follow them through the time step, which is indicated by the red lines, you see that the same neurons that were in the right lower corner will now be shifted one bit to the left and one bit up. Same neurons. And that's true for all of these things. And that means that I can represent my density profile basically as something that never changes over time. If I just look at synaptic, if I just look at neural dynamics and I don't consider synaptic input, I can create a histogram that keeps track in each bit of the number of neurons. And I never have to change that. It will remain an accurate model for the density. What does change is where these neurons are. They will move from bin to bin, and that's indicated in the right-hand plot. So there are two areas. The one on the left represents the distribution of the neurons over this plot. So that's the density profile. The area on the top represents the bin boundaries of the linear integrated fire dynamics. And I've chosen that in a clever way. They are equidistant in time. What you see is that the bins on the right-hand side are bigger than on the left-hand side. And that is the reason why neurons that are on the right-hand side move up to the left-hand side. What I have to do, the only thing that I have to do in order to model the linear integrated fire is to change the relationship between the density bins on the bottom and the array that represents my bin boundaries on the top. So I have to do nothing. In terms of programming, if you're into that, it's point object. I calculate the solution of this complex equation, but I do it by doing nothing. I basically do a big bookkeeping, but that's all there is. And does that work? Well, we'll see. If I do what I just said, and I create a Gaussian density profile in the beginning, then what you see if you do that is that this peak shows a Gaussian decay, and that makes perfect sense. If you have a neuron, a single neuron, at some potential and you leave it alone, it will decay. So if you have some Gaussian distribution at the beginning of your simulation, all the neurons that are in that peak will decay, so the whole Gaussian peak will decay. But what I want to convey to you is that what you just saw with motion, which in itself is a solution of a complex balancing function, is achieved just by updating some pointers and doing nothing. And you can do that for any kind of neural dynamics. That is very important. You can then say, okay, that of course is not sufficient. We also have synaptic input. And I want to find my slides there. You also have synaptic inputs. There we are. How do we deal with that? Well, that is a little bit more complicated, but not very much. Basically, what your synaptic input does is it shifts neurons from one bit to another. So if you look at the leftmost gradient, for example, if a neuron receives a spike, it will move from the leftmost gradient to one on the right. If it receives another input, it will shift another bin, etc., etc. So this is not a complex partial differential equation. This is a simple system of ordinary differential equation that shows how neurons transfer from bin to bin. And this, if you are familiar with it, is the master equation for the Poisson process, and it shows you how the density profile changes under the influence of spiking input if you have no neural dynamics. So if you have a very simple neuron which only keeps the membrane potential it currently has, but it is sensitive to synaptic input, and if it receives synaptic input, then you shift, then that is the process you're talking about. And I can also show that in isolation to convey to you that this is really just a very simple process. And in the beginning, you see all the neurons are at rest. They are at the leftmost peak. They receive nothing. And then some neurons will receive a spike, and they move one bit higher. And at some point, all neurons get a spike, and they move away from the equilibrium point. Some neurons are very unlucky, receive many, many spikes. And over time, you see this profile develop. And this becomes a Gaussian, basically, due to the central limit theory. So this is simple, well-understood statistics. Now, if you put it all together, you get the simulation that I've just shown the histogram. This is a group of leaky integrated fire neurons. On the right-hand side, you see the membrane potential, and you see that the neurons, on the one hand, are being kicked by the synaptic input. On the other hand, the leaky integrated fire dynamics transmission back. On the left-hand side, you see the firing rate. I'll show it again. And oops, one more. This is the decay here. So I need one. On the left-hand side, you see the fire rate, and that comes up as soon neurons go over threshold. Then you see fire. And now you see the trough, and you see convergence to steady state. Do not be misled by the smoothness of these curves. This curve is a smooth curve, but it indicates Poisson rates, and the individual neurons in the population are spiking irregularly. Now you can do this, you can put it together. I've just shown the binning for leak integrated fire and the binning for quadratic integrated fire is different. If you look at the matrix that shows the Poisson transfer process from bin to bin, you get a matrix that indicates, the black indicates loss, so neurons always tend to move away from the state they are, and they end up population and neurons that are higher. So somewhere you see this white line which indicates the gain of neurons that you see. And the funny bar on the right hand side is the reset potential. So you see neurons being reset with certain potential and they appear better. And you can play the same game. Thank you. You can see the same game for you can see the same game for quadratic integrated fire units, which I won't show into detail. But due to the difference in dynamics, the binning that you have to pick is very different. The bin boundaries are very different, but the mechanism is very much the same. So by putting it together, I mean you run the Poisson master equation. You do a shift operation and you repeat that in fast succession. And as you see, there is no real solution methods for partial differential equations involved. And that is very useful. So we have a population level simulation method. It matches sparking neuron simulations exactly within statistics, as long as you have enough number of neurons, and as long as the identity of individual neurons does not matter too much. You can record the neural dynamics in the bin boundaries, and you do that at the start of the simulation. You can even provide at the start of the simulation an array of bin boundaries and saying, oh, this is my neural dynamics. In other words, you have a very generic method that even would work if you would have a new neural model that you would not have defined at this point in time. And moreover, there is no reason why this can't be extended to higher dimensional models. It can deal with any synaptic distribution. It contains the diffusion limit as a special case. It can solve for Kaplan equations as a special case, but it's not limited to that. There's no smoothness assumption. And in the 1D case, it's pretty efficient because it's 10 to 100 times faster than doing a corresponding simulation in a conventional simulator like this. How am I for time? How much time do I have to live?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So, quadratic integrated fire units. I'll show you a very extreme example of quadratic integrated fire units. Here you see the density for quadratic integrated fire units. It looks very different from leak integrated fire units. Why? Well, because we are looking at this process where neurons are endogenously spiking. Neurons are spiking constantly. So you're looking at a model of a population that is firing synchrony. And if you follow it through a large time, and if you set all the neurons at the same potential, then in state space you would get a big peak because all the neurons start at the same membrane potential and they stay there because they're firing. And what we're doing is over time we decorrelate them with a very small synaptic. Now the reason why the density huddles in the center is that if you look at the previous diagram, is that they move pretty fast everywhere. They spike, but they move most slowly in the center. So most neurons will be in the center, although they're all spiking. So if you look at any point in time, you're most likely to find the neuron here where it is moving very slowly. And I'll show an explicit simulation of that. So you see this big peak. This big peak is a large group of neurons that all firing at the same time. And you see that it's a single spike in this now. And over time, because the neurons receive input, they're being knocked out of this peak, and they start to fire asynchronously. And the important point about this method is that it can deal with this peak. It can deal with a population that is firing synchronously, or it can deal with a population where parts of the neuron are firing synchronously or asynchronously. And that is interesting. What is also interesting is to look at circuits. And that really becomes much an exciting topic. And it starts to move towards the ideas of Professor Adeli yesterday, where he showed chaotic dynamics. And what we can look at is very simple circuits of excitatory and inhibitory neurons. And I'll first show you an example of steady-state firing neurons. So the top is an excitatory group of neurons. The bottom is an inhibitory group of neurons, which is slightly faster. And it reaches threshold first. And because it reaches threshold first, and it's inhibitory, it starts to inhibit itself, but it's also being driven by external input, so it's sort of this behavior. Now the excitatory neurons start with big threshold data, and they are connected excitatory among themselves. And they start to stimulate both the excitatory and inhibitory population. And it's just a question of whether the inhibitory population moves quickly enough to keep this circuit in check or not. And in this case, we took the parameters in such a way that they do. And again, it's very interesting to look at these curves and not to be deceived by the smoothness of these curves. What you see here is a group of neurons that are firing with Poisson spike trains, where the excitatory neurons and the inhibitory neurons keep each other in check. And as you can see, they have a Gaussian profile that is mostly well below threshold. So most of the dynamics of this circuit actually plays in the subthreshold domain. Of course, the neurons communicate with each other and influence each other by spikes. But what you can see, and this is particularly interesting, you see firing rate rise, but the population lowers. Why does the firing rate rise? Because also the peaks become broader, and therefore some neurons still are being pushed above threshold. And there's a lesson in here for people who work with rate-based models. If you work with your mass models and you think you can characterize the firing of your population in terms of, say, the average membrane potential or the median membrane potential, you're in for a surprise because you saw the median membrane potential go down, but the firing rate still is going up. So that's interesting. It doesn't take much to actually get very chaotic. Well, let's not use the word chaotic. We're not quite there yet, but you can easily change these circuits. And for a while, you might think that, okay, this is a threshold behavior where the neurons just do not reach the threshold, and therefore there's no firing rate. That's not entirely true. There's very slow dynamics, and from this moment on, it is very, very wild what's going on really. And you may ask yourself, maybe this is too wild, maybe this is too unrealistic. Well, you can argue about that. We did some work about that, of course. I'm going to shut that down. Presentation. This is some validation that I'm showing. This is maybe interesting for the experimentalist. You can validate your method with Monte Carlo, and you can simulate, you can use Poisson input spike and simulate white noise. And white noise is characterized by mean and variance, and of course, if you have my high mean, you will get a bigger firing rate, and if you have lower firing, if you have lower variance, then it takes much longer for the transition in the firing rate to die out. If you have a high variance in the input signal, then the population is smeared much more rapidly. And this shows that you actually are accurate and that you can do validation against Monte Carlo simulation of spiking units and the population density dynamic matches the output variable. So what you see here is firing rate, transient firing rates as function of time for different mean, and variance of the Gaussian white noise. And if you look at the steady state firing rate, which would be the point if you let it go for long enough, and you plot that, you get a plot that probably is familiar for some of the experiments that called gain curves, transfer curves. And in the case of diffusion, you can actually calculate analytically what this firing rate should be. The markers are the result of our population density methods. The red error bars come from the Monte Carlo simulation. The analytic calculation, the Monte Carlo simulation, and the population density prediction are in perfect agreement with each other. And what you see here is interesting. You see the role of variance here. What you see here is that although the average stimulation of the neuron population is below the threshold, you still see the response. And that happens because there's variability in the input spikes. Sometimes you can have low response input, but you can have fluke spike frame that would still cause a neuron to fire. And therefore, even below threshold, you will see a response from the fire. And this is a curve that has been measured experimentally a lot, and that can be corrected also. And if you're doing measurements and they involve noisy inputs to your neurons, then this is a good way of looking at this. You can also say, well, Poisson, in not in all cases, is a good approximation for white noise. So let's do that on purpose to see whether outside of the diffusion approximation, we still do well. So the Monte Carlo simulation and the population density results still match up perfectly, but the analytic results due to a diffusion approximation no longer hold, and that's a good result for us. Okay, this is a wacky idea, but, and this is the last thing I'm going to show, a simulation. But if you look at the quadratic integrated firing, then basically it behaves like a linear integrated firing. And if you reset it again, then it's not so different from a reset, from a linear integrated firing. But an idea from Izikevich is that there are neurons in the human brain, in biology, that are typed as class 2 neurons. And that is, most neurons, many neurons will respond in a graded way to synaptic input, but some neurons will respond in a binary fashion. You hit them, and they keep spying for a while. And Izikevich's idea was to make a very simple model with the help of quadratic integrated firing neurons, where you say, okay, we use the same model, except that the neurons will be reset at a reset potential that is in the spiking regime. So if you start with a neuron here and you leave it alone, it will converge to the equilibrium point. If you hit it and it hits a spike, it will be reset and it will keep on spiking for a while. Yeah. And that's an interesting one. It sort of is a very good model of what class 2 neurons do, but it's as binary as you can get, right? The neuron has not been hit, it won't spike. Hasn't been hit, then it will spike. Well, let's have a look. Let's have a look at the population. That receives no input on average, but at some point it receives an excitatory and an inhibitory input, and they're perfectly balanced. So there's no net input current, never in the simulation. But what does happen when the excitatory and inhibitory neuron hit at the same time is they do create variance. And because they create variance, some neurons will actually be hit enough by a fluke spike train to be pushed over threshold and spike. And when they spike, they keep on spiking. So how does that look at the population? It looks like this. So first, no input, no net input, variability. And what you saw is it was very quick, but each time that an input happens, you see that some neurons get lucky and they're being caught there, and they're being forced to spike forever. And what you see here, basically, on the left-hand side, is that the firing rate goes. And you see that this group of neurons used in this way is because it is some neurons that are getting, and not all neurons are getting. They are capable of a graded population of response. And what you saw here in the firing rate was basically an integration of variability, not of mean input, but of variability. So looking at it at population level, you can find different ideas for coding. Variability is almost as important as net input. And although individual the neurons respond binary, the population can respond in a very graded level. And do things that you would not have considered in the first time. If I'm allowed 2 more minutes to finish, is that okay? I'm not claiming that this is realistic in any way. It's a wacky idea, but some of the progress has come from wacky ideas. So I'm not claiming that this is happening in the brain. But what I'm claiming is that having a dynamical way of looking at populations, your ideas of coding can shift as well. Right. Briefly mentioned this, but you're not stuck to Poisson statistics. For the most part, I've talked about Poisson statistics because it's very simple. The method allows you to do spike trains with memory kernel. I'm not going to talk in detail about that. I've just mentioned that in case somebody is interested. I have a PhD student who has looked at the basal ganglia circuit. And basically, this is a circuit just like the one I showed, excitatory and inhibitory connections, and there are also self-connections that we could consider later on. And what we wanted to validate is that this circuit is not steady state like the one I showed, but it's basically steady state in some cases and oscillatory in some other cases. And what Elaine was interested in is investigating claims of Hidalgo et al. That in order for oscillations, you need strong connections between the excitatory and the inhibitory population, and you need large transmission delays. And she did a very systematic study and basically found that this matched sort of what was already in the literature, and that gave us some confidence. So what you see here is the increase of one connection, the increase of another connection. And you see that both of them increase the oscillatory connections, and also if you increase the time delays between the populations, something that I haven't mentioned explicitly, but which you can do, that you're also more prone to oscillations. So reproducing the literature results gave us more confidence in what followed later. What you often see is that you can create oscillations where you see a substructure. And often, but not always, these oscillations repeat. And if you follow them for a long time, they have this regular beat pattern with a low frequency envelope, which you probably would see if you were looking for it in local field potential. If you look at the population level, something very interesting has happened. You see these double and triple peaks, and they are caused by the fact that these populations have split in the subpopulations, and that is interesting. These subpopulations are labeled by the firing rate alone. They are the same neurons. The whole population as such is homogeneous, but nevertheless, you find that some neurons end up in different bunch of probability density, which code for different moments in the oscillation. That is quite remarkable, and in a way that is a hint of chaos, because these neurons were together at some point in the initial study. And if you plot the irregular firing rates of some point, you see that sometimes the firing rates do not repeat each other. You see here the excitatory firing rate plotted versus the inhibitory firing rate, and you see very intricate, very interesting population. So this is something that repeats itself after a long time, but you also can see things where it's very doubtful that the signal ever repeats itself. And this starts to connect to the talk that we saw yesterday. This is the onset, we believe, of chaos. And where Professor Andrelli yesterday looked at it from a phenomenological point of view, looking at the EEG signal and finding there was chaos in there, we looked at it from the inside out. We couple excitatory and inhibitory neurons, and we find, first of all, that there's almost no escaping from oscillations. In fact, it's very difficult to get these groups of neurons not to engage in some kind of oscillatory activity. But we also find that they're actually quite prone to probably chaotic activity, although we've not shown this in any formal way. I want to stop here. There are many results on this. If you're interested, I can send you papers with these results. I want to mention that independently of us, IWINAC have produced a very similar result to us. And we have simulated. And this simulator is something that we developed as part of the Brain project, which also funds our research in the theory group. So we want to acknowledge that funding. I want to acknowledge the help of Elaine Duffin in investigation, the oscillatory behavior, and Yiming Lai, a postdoc, who's been working on the population density techniques, and who has been focusing on the non-causal aspect of it, funding fund. If you want to use this simulator, contact me. But it is called Mind, and if you look for it on the internet, you'll find it. So to conclude, I said everything best. So thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much for your presentation. I think that it's interesting that. I think it's very interesting that theoretical work can open the vision, right, to understand how neurons work in the brain. So I have a question about these class 2 neurons. These neurons that you describe as coding variability, right? Yes, you said that the class 2 neurons was coding variability. So when you talk, you're talking about that you have a population of neurons and you have individual neurons that could code the variability of the whole population.
Yeah.
Okay. The first question is, when you're talking about variability, are you talking about that these neurons are computing the variance of the population response?
Shall I show the simulation? Does that help in answering the question?
Well, as variability, do you understand variance or?
Oh, variance, yes. So what happens is that you have to think that all of these neurons, so what I've shown in the simulation is that most of the time the neurons do not receive anything. And then suddenly at the same time, excitatory and inhibitory input comes in. And that is on the population. An individual neuron receives a sample of that. So it receives an excitatory spike train and an inhibitory spike train. And these spike trains are drawn from Poisson input. That means that an individual neuron may be lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, and receive more of its share of excitation than inhibition. Then it will be hit, and it could be hit to such an extent that it actually would fire, and then it would remain fired. So, but how many neurons in the population undergo that fate? Well, that is something that the simulation shows. It shows that a small minority of the neurons actually being hit, and that's why you saw this very small bit of density in the right-hand side. Let me show it again. So you see the neurons, there's a very small peak on the right-hand side, which is the neurons that are being hit. They were unlucky to be hit like that, but that's their fate. Now they're doomed to fire for it in this somewhat simple. And what you see is, there were 3 peaks where this occurred. So every now and then there are neurons that are being selected, that are being unlucky, and that are being stimulated across session. And the bigger the variance is, the more neurons in the population will undergo that fate. So
my question is, I don't know if you know the literature about contrast in the visual system. I mean, how there are different ways to measure contrast, global contrast. And one of these measures is by computing the standard deviation of a population of neurons, computing local contrast. Okay, so this is kind of artificial of computing, right? The global contrast. So would it be possible that these population and these neurons that could spike depending on the variability could compute this kind of global contrast? Understanding global contrast as
Yes,
the variance of the whole population?
I don't know enough about the visual system to answer that in detail, but if you would broadly looking in a cortical area where I know a little bit more about, and if you say, well, in this cortical area, there's now suddenly an influx of variability, maybe because of some sensory input, would that cause the firing rates of that population to go up? Yes, it would. So I think qualitatively, my answer would be yes, although I'm wanting to be a bit cautious, not knowing enough about the visual system. But I'm convinced that variability is as much as an input as input itself in some parts of the brain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. We move to the next invited speaker. Please let me introduce you, Richard Duro Fernandez, Professor Richard Duro Fernandez. And first of all, I want to introduce him as a friend. He was one of the promoters of IWINAC and one of the supporters every year on this international meeting. So Richard, thank you for helping supporting our meeting. And then the official bio, your CV. He is full professor at the computation department at the University of Coruña. He made his PhD in physics. He's the coordinator of the research group about bioengineering. Okay, his main research lines are cognitive mechanism, biosphere computation, intelligent computation, and autonomous robotics. His group is mainly devoted to knowledge transfer to industry, to SMEs, etc. He is in the campus of Ferrol in Coruña, and he has been developing more than 200 projects about knowledge transfer. So it's a great pleasure to give you the talk.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me over there? I think we can. Okay, good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this IWINAC for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to be with friends and to talk about the things we're interested in. Today, when they contacted me, they said I could talk about anything I wanted. I decided to talk about the things I like. It's basically factors. So today I decided to talk about factors. People didn't believe me yesterday when I told them, but I decided that's what I was going to talk about. And I'll present some thoughts about tractors and dreaming machines. And from a completely different point of view of our previous speaker, more from a top-down perspective on things in our area, instead of this bottom-up perspective that some other people try to see. So basically, my talk will be divided. This is basically an outline. I'll first spend some time digressing, which is always good at the beginning of a talk. And then talk a little bit about economics and science, some philosophy. And after that, the ones who bear with me, we'll start looking at nature and see some general principles and imitating cognition, and make a small case for dreaming machines through the presentation of a particular approach. And then I'll present some conclusions. So let's go with the interesting part of the talk. Some people like farming, and they want to get great natural products. They want these products to be in a very good quantity and quality so that they can survive in their production. And they want to do it in a way that's sustainable for the future. And that's great. The problem is I like tractors personally. Tractors, since I was living in a farm in Tennessee when I was a little kid, I became very attached to these machines, very powerful, strong machines. We can do lots of things with tractors. I love those. And then, obviously, there are people that build these tractors. And their objective is usually to produce reliable, cost-effective, powerful machines. These guys that build the tractors, they're not farmers, I guess. In fact, even though tractors are tools for farming, and they can be used in agriculture, when you start focusing too much on tractors themselves and their characteristics, you get things like this, which are usually, they are completely useless for farming. And in many cases, especially where I come from, in the north of Spain, where plots are very small, tractors mostly use this. So in some cases, if we want to do some farming, maybe it's more efficient to use some other way of doing it, the classical people-oriented way. This is very much about computing, as you can see. Okay, so I'm going to go into our computing area a little bit more. So, what did we used to want in our area? So, we wanted machines that were able to autonomously learn and survive in the world and do their assigned tasks, reaching the level of intelligence of humans. This is not my sentence, I took it from somebody in the 60s. And we actually wanted that rather fast. If you take a look back at history of artificial intelligence, you can see that, for example, Simon was saying that in 58, he was saying that in 10 years, a digital computer will be the world's chess champion. In 65, he was saying that within 20 years, machines will be capable of doing anything a man can do. And then came Minsky, who was even more optimistic. In 67, he was talking about a generation to get these things done. But in 70, I don't know, probably had some breakthrough there. In 1970, he was already saying that in 3 to 8 years, there would be a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being. I guess he was quite optimistic. But in fact, as we all know here, and we're all aware, the world is a very complicated place. Noisy, exotic, not completely known, etc., etc., etc. And machines are not humans. Machines have different sensing and actuation mechanisms. They have different bodies, different morphologies from what humans are. And all of this depends on the structure of the neuron, like Maturana Varela said in the 90s. So basically, there was a lot of hype in that time. You know, from the beginning, modest beginnings, AI in the 40s, 50s. You know, some people started working on symbolic AI, and they got all excited about it. We all know this history. And they started selling all kinds of claims that were, I'd say they're unashamedly amplified, and they grossly underestimated the real problems they were facing. So what happened? Well, at the end of the 70s, funding dried up because all the promises were not fulfilled. But as a scientific group, we didn't learn very much from it, so we started making claims again. And we had a new boom in Dexter systems and 5th generation computers, especially in lab. And then again, the bubble exploded, no funding again. Too bad. So, as a community, we decided that, well, this large claim didn't work too well, so we split up into many subfields. Actually, we started splitting up in the 80s. Lots of different subfields, very focused on very specific problems. Yeah, we all had that pressure. We had to publish. We have to publish fast. This pressure has been increasing since the 80s, like crazy. And now, if you don't publish 100 papers per year, you're not going to know that. So we started splitting in those fields. We started doing very small things related to very specific topics. But now we're in the temptation again. We're getting a temptation of the big funding. So we're starting to talk about intelligent robots. As you saw yesterday with the robot we had here. We put some little algorithm or a little voice on the robot and we call it intelligent. And we try to sell it. And people will probably very soon feel that we're not achieving the expectations again, and we'll have a next bubble exploding. But anyway, this is all controlled by the economy. Everybody needs funding for their research, everybody needs to publish, so we're all doing all this fast publishing business. So what is my point? My basic point is that mainstream artificial or computational intelligence basically has lost sight of the problem. It is not concerned anymore with understanding or producing intelligence in general. But rather, we've mostly gone into producing useful and fast results in specific areas and for very, very specific and concrete problems. I call that smart algorithms. I have to admit that the results have been very good. I mean, people have published a lot. They're getting very good results in certain areas, which is not bad at all. But it's not the main objective we had in our artificial intelligence center. So, in my opinion, we're not looking at things the right way. And as a consequence, the solutions we obtain are not really solutions that are appropriate for the main problem. As I say there, do we really need classifiers with 99.6 accuracy for producing intelligence? Probably not. Like we don't need tractors with 6 wheels and 200 horsepower or 2,000 horsepower. So perhaps to address the real intelligence problem, that's basically my point, it is necessary to address it in a holistic way. Okay? The devil is in the interrelations between components and how they can complement each other, and not only on the components themselves. So, having made my point, so what is the problem nowadays? Well, the problem nowadays, in my opinion, is still the same problem as it was 50 years ago. The only thing is now that we're more technologically advanced and aesthetics are nicer. So we make things look a lot better than they used to do it. But the problem is still exactly the same. Get machines that reach the level of intelligence of humans, or even beyond that. So, what has nature done about it? Well, nature has gone and obtained an autonomously operating and non-completely predetermined, open-ended, lifelong learning brain-body system. That's a long sentence to say. What have we been doing? Well, most of the papers, if you take a look at the autonomous robotics papers, they're working on program control. There are very, very, very few people addressing the open-ended, lifelong problem. So, maybe we should be looking at that. So how did nature go about it? Or what do we know about how nature did it? Well, nature basically works through evolution. And it has basically evolved this brain-body system, but it has done it in a very particular way in order to make the individuals that resulted from this evolution adaptable to the context they find when they're born. So it has evolved the structures and some of the knowledge that helps to kickstart learning, and then it has allowed these structures to be able to learn and to interact in real time, so that they can adapt to what they find every day, depending on how much learning, how much pre-programming it has included. The individual will be more or less adaptive to the world. So this evolution, well, it took about 3 billion American years to obtain what we think we have now in terms of cognition. And it went through lots of stages that were reflected both on the structures that make up the brain and on the capabilities of this cognitive structure that we have now, from stimulus response behaviors or capabilities to perception, induction, abduction, deduction, action structures. Actually, different species have gone different paths, so we still have species that only present stimulus response, but we do have now some species that at least think that they can induct, abduct, and deduct. What does this mean in terms of producing systems that can do this? Well, I don't think we can wait 3 billion years to generate cognition completely from scratch, obviously. So some of the components will have to be designed, taking inspiration from what we know of what nature has done. But we have to be careful here. We don't want to over-design, because if we over-design, the resulting entities will be less adaptable. So, in my opinion, what we should be designing is the basic operational structure that allows the selection and acquisition of knowledge, the learning, through free, open-ended interaction with the world, but not the knowledge itself. So, we should be trying to produce a software-hardware structure that allows embodied situated systems to autonomously and open-endedly acquire and use knowledge from interactions with the world during its whole life, so that it's able to perform its task duties and fulfill its motivations. This is basically what is called a cognitive architecture. So we should be trying to produce cognitive architectures from any perspective we want. Cognitive architectures are machines, body, brain systems that have to learn during the whole life in an open-ended manner. And that's a big, big problem, because we have multisensorial data streams that intermingle data corresponding to different events in time, out of which we have to make sense. We have to decide what's going on. They only provide partial information. The world is dynamic, so we're changing context continuously and solicitations. The data we need to acquire knowledge nuggets that does not come in as a batch. We just have to extract it from different episodes. And to make some sense, we would need for things that are learned to scaffold new learning processes. And above all, we must ensure that knowledge is grounded. So that's a big problem. And the world, it's a complex and confusing place. So that makes it very, very difficult to address the lifelong learning problem, because it should be working by taking small steps and building on what is already known. So we need to provide some way of simplifying and focusing over this complex sensor flows. Listen, Miguel said that you can only learn what you almost already know. And I tend to agree with that. It's very hard to learn things that are very far from what we already know. So what did nature do about it? Well, natural systems usually, especially natural systems that are supposed to be more autonomous, okay? More adaptable to their environments, usually come with a pre-programmed development stage. Like children, you don't learn everything in one shot. You start by learning very simple things by constraining the environment in which you're learning and the pieces you're moving of the body and stuff. And start learning the first elements that allow you to learn to construct on top of them new learning processes. So basically, we get into situations where we almost know something and we learn it in order to continue finding new situations where we almost know something and we learn. That's what development is all about. Okay. So the difference between what most people are doing in a traditional way versus a developmental approach is what I stated. You know, a traditional approach is you start with a task, you understand it, and you design a task-specific representation. You program it or make your system learn it, and then you call it artificial intelligence. And for that specific task, you see the representation you generated, and then you run the program in your machine. That's what 99% of the literature is doing, especially in autonomous robotics. In the case of autonomous development, the approach is completely different. You basically design a base for a body according to the robot's ecological working conditions. Then you design a developmental program, and at birth, the robot starts to run that program, and through focus and filter interaction, it acquires knowledge from the world that can be later used to produce more knowledge, etc. In this approach, humans can even try to raise these robots by interacting with them in real time and showing them things. Okay, just to give an idea, there are two who's involved in this area, or what are the main contributions. We have two types of approaches. Approaches that were what we call non-native cognitive architectures, which were architectures that were not developed for robotics or for real interaction with the world. They were developed as artificial intelligence, let's say, games, like for ACTR or LIDA, which eventually incorporated some of these principles of the developmental learning in order to come into line with more modern architectures. And by the way, there's a review we did last year where you can find all these architectures and another native, what we call native robotic cognitive architectures, which are been developed mostly in the last 10 years or so, which already take a developmental view to this learning process, and they try to construct a basic machine that will be able to learn from interaction with the world. Okay, what do all of these systems have in common, or what have people decided or found out that were basic components you needed for a cognitive system? So first, you need motivation. You need a system that provides a reason or goal that directs action. You need representations, which allows you to express relationships. You need learning processes that allow you to acquire these relationships, which is basically knowledge. You need decision or problem-solving processes in order to manipulate these representations. You need memories in order to remember things. It seems very obvious, but people tend to forget some of these when they build their systems. And you need, which is very, I think it's much more important, you need embodiment so that grounding can be achieved. You need a machine, a real machine, a complete machine. And you need an interesting environment, otherwise you don't learn anything. So let's talk a little bit about these things. For example, motivation. Motivation is something that people tend to forget when they construct their intelligence systems. They usually make it implicit by the goal they want to achieve and don't leave it open-ended so that the system can establish its own goals. Motivation is basically the why of doing. And in my opinion, it's what makes, well, one of the most important areas that needs to be addressed if we want to have autonomous and really intelligent machines. Motivation can act as a filter. When you have extremely complicated environments, you have to filter out information. You have a goal, you will concentrate only on what is relevant to that goal, and you will filter everything else out. So it helps with the data stream you're getting. And it can also provide a way to decompose interactions with the world into blocks that are a lot easier to learn and to reuse, which is also very important. In the last 5 to 10 years, some people have started to study motivational aspects. Some of them, like Gary, have done a lot of papers on that. But it's still a wide open topic with no real final conclusions yet on how things should be done. We'll have our own idea. So let's not get lost in the language. What is a motivation? Motivation, if you start reading the literature, you will find thousands of psychology-based papers on motivation. And you generally see that it's basically a posteriori labeling done by psychologists of why some animal or machine has done something. So in computational terms, that's not very useful. So in computational terms, it's probably a lot better to talk about goals in terms of a particular state we want the machine to reach, what the machine should reach. And we can talk about urges or drives as a measure of the distance to that goal, to that particular state. Some people, me included, usually talk about satisfaction instead of urges as an inverse of that urge distance. Okay. So we can, those urges or satisfactions are imposed by the environment. They're not something that the system decides. The system, what the system can do is to model these satisfactions or urges as a satisfaction function. And it can even manipulate that function in order to generate what we call expectation functions. So, for example, you can have a system that can do lots of things before it eats something. It only gets fulfillment of its urges when it eats. So a function that describes when he will eat, that describes that when he eats, or when he eats, he will be very happy. It's not very useful in order to find how to eat. But if the system finds itself in many situations, it can generate a new function, an expectation function, that allows it to provide some value to the states that are leading towards the state where it eats. That's what an expectation function is. Okay, so most systems that use motivations for operation usually seek what's called a homeostatic state. Basically, we need to have no pain and no uncomfortable, and be completely comfortable, which is usually expressed in terms of minimization of urge values. And that's usually not enough for to have an intelligent system, because you need to generate an adequate dynamics for learning. So there are other motivations that need to be considered. For example, seek novelty. Okay? Learn the fastest possible. Things like that. Those are heterostatic drives that will keep you moving all the time, like little kids do. So, usually we come pre-programmed with some basic drives, which were created by evolution, in fact, or phylogenetic. For example, symptomology or avoid pain, that pain sensors, so that came for evolution. But that's usually not enough. We need to be able to generate context-dependent drives. For example, if you want to eat, you have to open the refrigerator or you have to go to the supermarket. Those are motivations or drives that are not really programmed into us. They depend on the context, on the environment we're located in. And we have to learn or create those motivations and sub-motivations, or instrumental, that's what they're really called, motivational drives, in order to be able to adapt to our world. So, when designing a cognitive system, the designer has to provide, first, a set of basic terms. That's pretty obvious. Like we have for evolution. But then, it needs to provide a system, a mechanism within the cognitive architecture that allows the machine to learn these satisfaction or expected satisfaction functions so they can make decisions throughout its lifetime. And what is more important, it needs a mechanism that allows for the generation of new instrumental drives so that it can divide its interaction with the world into manageable blocks that can be easily learned. And until now, most, it's too risky to say all, but almost all cognitive structures that have been proposed do not contemplate this last part. So they're very limited in their scope. Okay, so once we have drives, once we have a motivational system, things become a lot easier from a computational point of view. Once we have a motivational system, any system will have a body, for it will have some perceptions. These perceptions can always be sort of in a Markovian way. They can always be associated to perceptions and actions. My current perceptions correspond or are related to the perceptions I had 1 instant ago and the actions I performed and whatever happened in my environment at that time. So I can relate that to a function that I call W. Satisfaction function, which represents the degree of fulfillment of the drives, can be expressed as a function of our state, and our state is given by our perception. So satisfaction is a function of W that I generated before. And what we want to do is fulfill our urges or maximize our satisfaction. So all our cognitive process is a problem of maximizing satisfaction. If we express that in a very simple diagram, well, you have perception and action, which allows you to predict perception in the next instant of time. So you can evaluate if that next perception will be satisfactory, and you can use that evaluation in order to try different actions until you obtain the action that's optimal for you, or the sequence of actions, however you want to do it. So basically, a cognitive structure is no more than this. The problem with this is that you need to know this function, W, you need to know this function. And you need to be able to test actions inside of yourself, inside your brain, in order to decide which is the optimal one for you. So you have learning processes in order to obtain these functions from the environment, and you have some decision processes in order to decide on an action. Well, the learning process is over models, predictive models. W is basically a world model, satisfaction model, and you have your decision processes. Obviously, to do anything, you need to be able to have information from the world. So every system usually has an episodic buffer, and we do too, which is basically just a series of perceptions we have had, satisfactions, and actions we have done. Every instant of time we have interacted with the world. So this is basically reality. We're a system, we're interacting, we know what we perceive, we know how satisfied we were, and we know what action we took. Learning world models, once we have this perception, satisfaction, action, triplets for different instances of time, it's very easy. All you need to do is you stick your perception in time t, you stick your action in time t, you see what your model obtained in time t plus 1, and you compare to what reality said that your perception was going to be in time t plus 1. And you use that as an error signal to train somehow, however you want, your system. You can do the same thing with the satisfaction. So basically, by interacting with the world, it should be rather easy to obtain these models. There are hundreds of techniques to do that. And action selection is basically an optimization process. You're searching for an action space, and you're trying to find which action or sequence of actions is the optimal for your operation. Okay, this is what I just said. It's basically what, to a greater or lesser extent, all cognitive mechanisms do. I'm going to use a particular one just to show you the next stages and to show you how this field is moving. And I'm going to use a model we have developed over the years to see how things went and what we did and why we did it and what you can do with it. Okay? So this mechanism is called the multi-level Darwinist brain. Some of you know it. You presented this before. Basically, what the multi-level Darwinist brain does, the MDB, is convert both the learning processes and the action selection process into an evolutionary optimization problems. Okay, so we use evolution in the computational sense to learn world models and satisfaction models. And we use evolution in order to find the correct action or the most satisfactory action. The initial ideas for the MDB were formulated at the end of the 90s. But at that time, they were not really published because they were not very popular. At that time, we had groups and the elephants don't play chess, paper, and all these behavior-based robotics was in full swing, and anything that had models in it was not really considered very. It was not the thing. It was not considered the thing. But eventually, at the beginning of 2000, we published the first version of the MDB, 2002, and it was a very, very simple version of what I just talked about before. So basically what you have is you have an action, you apply that action on the environment, remove the leg or do whatever, that generates a new perception. This perception is inserted into the episodic process, and we generate an evolution process that tries to fit a world model and a satisfaction model to what's present in this episodic process. Okay? At that time. One of the keys here is that you don't want this model to be specific to this episodic effect in particular at a given instant of time. You want it to be specific to the context you're in. And the context you're in comes from all the perceptions that you're seeing over time for a while. And not all of them may fit in the episodic buffer. So this evolutionary process is in order to not converge to a particular episodic buffer. It's only for 2, 3, 4 evolutionary steps. Okay. So once you evolve, you run your 2 or 3 evolutionary steps. You take your best world model, your best satisfaction model, you stick them in the action optimization part of your architecture, and you start trying out action over the perception you're having and obtain the satisfaction which action produces until you get the best one, basically. You can do that evolutionarily, you can do any other kind of optimization process to do that. So you say that's very simple, that's very fast, that's very easy. And can we do something with this? Well, yes, we can. If I manage to get this thing going. Okay. Let's see if it works. Okay, yeah. Okay, this is a hexapod robot. This is from 2000. 2003, something like that. And we wanted the robot to learn to walk. So basically, in this case, we imposed a drive, and the drive is to get to that white block that's there. So the robot had to learn first that being closer to the white block is more satisfactory than being far away from it. So it learned the satisfaction function. And it also had to learn a world model that associated how it moved its legs with the perception it had of the white block, in order to be able to perform actions that would get it closer to the white block. Okay? So you can see here how the error of the models with respect to the world really increased. And you can see in the slide that at the beginning, the robot, the first interaction, the robot walked very badly, very inefficiently. Sometimes it didn't even walk, shook. As it interacted more with the world, you can see that it starts to work to walk in a more efficient fashion, and it gets closer and closer to the white block. In the end, it obtains a typical tripod gait, which is a very, very efficient and stable way of walking for a hexapod, and it always reaches the white block. So it actually learned to walk, and the only thing we had to impose is that it was more satisfactory to be close to the white block, period. All the rest of the relationships were learned using the MDB. So this is a very basic implementation of the NDB. We've done lots of other experiments that there's no time to show them all. It's a very basic. And obviously now, if we try to teach him something else, it will forget. It will forget what he just learned, because we have no memory. So our next step was to try to deal with the memory issues. And it's not really true that we have no memory. We do have some memory. Short-term memory, because we do have a working memory. But we do have a sensory memory. We have all these episodic buffers that we've been keeping there. So that's a sensory memory. And we do have a working memory. Evolutionary processes have a population of models and of models that are being evolved. So in reality, that can be considered a sort of a working memory. What we don't have is a long-term memory that allows me to remember something I learned and bring it back whenever I need it. So next we wanted to try to see how we could stick a long-term memory in the MDB. So basically, we established a memory and some processes, which the details you can find on the papers, in order to decide if something should go into long-term memory. And the system works exactly the same as before, except for the fact that when something is satisfactory for a while, it will go into long-term memory, and that everything that is long-term memory will see the populations when I'm involved things. So that if something, some situation, some context that I've seen before, I see it again, I will have that model in my population, and it will be very efficient, very fast. So does this work? Well, it does. And I'm going to show an example. Actually, I'm going to explain it first. I'm sorry about the Spanish, but editing videos is not very small. What we did was take a robot, and we wanted it to learn to follow instructions from a teacher. Okay, so basically with provided the teacher will give instructions as notes, musical notes. Do will mean turn left, turn a little left. Me will mean perform a large turn left, etc. And the teacher will provide these instructions to the robot, and when the robot does something, the teacher will provide some feedback in terms of pain or pleasure. Okay? And we wanted to learn. Let's see if this works. Okay. I don't know if you can hear this. It's giving instructions. By the way, that's how this was here a long time ago when I was young. At the beginning, the robot makes doesn't do what the teacher does. By the way, we stuck that always back to the basket in the middle, so that we know that the teacher is trying to move the robot towards the trash can. See it. Sometimes the teacher does it. Sometimes the robot does it. Sometimes he does it. Let me start over. I'm sorry. I don't know how to go back. Okay. I don't know if you noticed, we had a first teacher, which was Francisco. The robot learned to do what the teacher did. Then we brought in a different teacher who didn't know anything about the language of the robot, so he established his own new language. And the robot had to relearn that language. He learned a new language in order to be able to follow the teacher's instruction. And then we brought Francisco back. And initially the robot was trying to work with the previous language, but in very few iterations, it brought back the language it had learned before and followed the instructions of the teacher. So basically, it took it around 50 to 60 iterations to learn one language, it took about 50 to 60 iterations to learn the second language, and then it only took about 7 or 8, actually less, 5 or 6 iterations, in order to recover the first language you can learn and follow the instructions of the first language. So you have long-term memory, which allows you to do things. But that long-term memory was only deliberate. We only save models. So things in the real world usually use procedural memories. So systems must be able to act fast first. We need to act fast, and we need to act without thinking sometimes in order to react to unforeseen situations. And it's also convenient to remember skills we learned. So we want to remember the actions we've been doing and when we've been doing it. So we need to represent actions and preserve the knowledge about actions in our system. The knowledge about actions, about sequences of actions, or about perception modulated associations. So in order to remember that, we have to change the representation for our procedure. And that's what we did. We changed the representation, and instead of representing actions as simple actions, we represent them as behaviors or policies in the terminology, another terminology. A behavior or a policy is just basically a function that maps perceptions into actions. Okay? So that implied changing the architecture. So now, what we're getting when we are evolving actions, we're not really evolving actions. We're evolving behavioral functions. So we're evolving functions that relate perceptions to actions. The best function that relates perception to actions is the current behavior. So according to the perception in the given instant, and the current behavior will provide directly function the action we have to perform on the environment, which will generate a new perception, etc. So if you see that, now we really have an execution scale that's completely independent from the learning scale. While this current behavior is operating, it will produce the required actions for the perceptions the robot gets just as long as it's being trained adequately. And only when this learned behavior is not valid, will we get a new behavior to substitute it from the learning stage? That's one of the things that changed. In the learning scale, now we also have behavior memory, behavior buffer, episodic buffer, so that we can evolve the behaviors. And how do we evaluate behaviors when we evolve? Well, we take perceptions from the episodic buffer, we put it through the behavior, that produces an action, that action goes to the world model, they will produce the predicted perception, and that predicted perception will be evaluated by the satisfaction model. So the behavior that produces the best satisfaction for all the actions in the episodic buffer will be the behavior that is selected. And obviously we have added a part of the long-term memory related to behaviors that we want to save for the future, so we can remember behaviors. And so just to show you an example of this working. See, as time passed, you can see we got a little bit more sophisticated in our interaction with the robot system, and we're getting more all the time. So in this case, we're just showing you exactly the same task as we did with the previous robot. Okay, just try to reach the robot is learning to follow the teacher's instructions. And the teacher is instructing it consistently to reach the ball, to get to the ball. At the beginning, it didn't know. As time passed by, it produced the correct models, which allowed it to obtain the correct behavior. And now it's following the instructions of the teacher very well. As you can see, when it follows the instructions of the teacher progresses. That's you do well, man. That's your feedback. That's your real drive, which the robot is modeling within its cognitive system. We'll just let it run for it. Right. Okay. But now it's learned the behavior, it's learned the models of the world. And the guy has identified that at the same time that he was getting very good satisfaction, when he was following the teacher's command, he was also getting very good satisfaction values the closer he was to the ball. Okay? So, he can operate without a teacher in order to increase his satisfaction just by reaching the ball. So we sort of taught it to reach balls. Okay? Alright, so what's missing here? Well, now we have a system that has memory, that has, it can do actions, it can get world models, but there are things missing here. We need to generalize the information we are getting. We have to model for different situations. We need to obtain generalizations from that. We need more powerful analysis methods. We would like to consolidate things, relate things in our memory. So now we need to play around with the information or the knowledge we have acquired from the world. And this is basically what we're doing now. And it's all being done taking into account the role of sleep in the human brain. So, well, I don't know if you noticed, but whenever I put a tree that's full with nature. During sleep, very, very briefly, we post-process information without the demands of real-time interaction. So, this is involved in the process of memory consolidation and enhancement. So, we consolidate declarative and non-declarative long-term memories. And we build new schemas for knowledge that lead to better modeling of the world. So in the context of an European project we're carrying out now, which is called Referred Restructuring of Experience in Autonomous Machines, it's a dream, which is a very simple name. We're trying to apply these kinds of ideas into a cognitive mechanism, well, in collaboration with some people from France, England, and the Netherlands. So the idea is to include sleep-related processes in cognitive architectures in order to generate representations that are more readily and efficiently reused by the robot, and in order to produce new knowledge from the knowledge we already acquired. So basically, this implies a new dreaming skill, a consolidation skill. We have a dreaming skill, which is just a set of processes that act over long-term memory in order to make that information more accessible and more usable by the rest of the architecture. That's saying it very fast and very simple, but that's basically the idea. And what types of things do we want to do there? Well, one of the things we want to do is to restructure things, rearrange things. When you're operating during the day, you need to operate fast, you need to do things in order to survive. So maybe the model you have is very specific to a certain part of your environment, and you get a different model for another part of your environment, and you might want to consolidate those two models into a single, more general model that corresponds to the whole environment, for example. Or you might want to have a policy or behavior and divide it into parts so that you can construct new policies by aggregating these parts in the future. So there are many processes you want to do that. There are many processes you want to do that. Another thing that we're doing there is exploiting the knowledge person. How do you exploit the knowledge person? You can run in your, when you're dreaming, you can run simulations using the models you've acquired, using the policies you've acquired, using the information you've acquired. You can run simulations to try to find things that, or policies or models that are better or better represent what you want to do the next day. For instance, just a very, very fast, I have to admit, I'm seeing these guys getting nervous. Started very late. Okay, this is a simulation, but this is the real robot. Here we had a binary robot. In real time, it was learning to follow that light using a light sensor. So it learned to follow that light. After several interactions, it could follow that light. And then, during the sleeping process, he figured out, through simulations of that same following the light process, he figured out that he could follow objects that did not have a light on them just by using the sonar sensors. Okay, so in a certain way, he generated a new behavior relating sonar sensors to moving towards the object. Okay, so that's the type of thing we're talking about here. Okay, and now what are we doing? This has been done last year, more or less. And now what are we doing? Well, we're working on the consolidation of knowledge. I mean, you're getting models, you're getting policies, you're keeping them in long-term memory. Small length policy is represented whatever by a neural network or whatever you want to represent it by. And there's a lot of information in the relationship between those things. You know, when my model says I'm in a disco, well, usually my policy is to dance. Okay, so there's a relationship there that I can probably use in the future. So we want to learn those relationships so that models, policies, etc., can be activated directly without having to evolve things. On the other hand, we're looking at representational redescription processes. I mean, it's not the same thing to try to process an image from the pixels than from where a block is located. And that's a representational redescription function. So how can we introduce representational redescription functions that are learned and can be reused and can be found during the sleep phase? That's what we're doing right now. That's the type of thing we're doing. So where are we going? And I'm almost finished. We're trying to progressively achieve a brain-like structure where all the elements will be operating in parallel in the architecture. Evolutionary learning will be active in the background all the time, but producing new elements that will only be consolidated depending on their success and needs. Otherwise, the system will be using what it has already learned. And the dream skill will come into play when the system is inactive. And we'll try to use the knowledge it has to generate new knowledge and run simulation games to make things better for the world the next day. But the main idea here is that we're always considering the complete embodied cognitive architecture. We go from sensing to action completely, and the whole in between. With better or worse capabilities, at the beginning they were worse. As time goes by, we get better capabilities, and the robot is interacting with the world in an open-ended manner all the time. So, coming back to the main topic, what have we learned about the tractors? Well, the first thing is tractors are great. I like tractors. The second thing is that maybe they are just a tool that needs to be combined with other tools and knowledge for the farmer to achieve his objectives. And a good tool is not the one that does everything in a very powerful and precise way, but rather the one that dependently does the task in the most effective and adaptable combination with the other parts, with the other tools. And the combination is the key word here. So when designing and choosing a tractor, I think in every iteration we should be looking at the whole farm and see what is better for the production of the farm. So I bet you know what I mean. Anyway, this is not the end. We're just starting to scratch the surface in this type of cognitive architectures. If you notice the references, most of them were from the last 10 years, and everything is still very basic. It's a completely wide open field where many things like motivation and other aspects have to be studied again. So, well, obviously I have to acknowledge the DREAM team, which are the people that are working with me on the DREAM project and on the MED architecture. And the funding, it's obvious that this needs to be acknowledged. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation on the overview. I have a question about the biological inspiration. If you have any biological inspiration to develop these perception, satisfaction, and action cycle. Probably you know that in cognitive psychology there's a paradigm called desire, satisfaction, and action. Has been developed the last 20 years. So I'd like to ask you if you have followed any of the ideas of this paradigm, or these approaches completely different from the approach that was followed in psychology or in physiology in the last 20 years.
In psychology, physiology, etc., you can find basically any approach you want. Just read the right books. There are so many theories that you can find basically anything you want. And yes, of course, this is based on lots of psychological studies. It's based on lots of physiological studies, and it's also based on lots of control studies, which are sometimes based on this type of studies. So yes, there is inspiration from that, obviously. The thing is that you have to be careful when you talk about psychological studies, because there are so many things with some of them, especially the older ones, with such flimsy methodological background, let's say it that way, that it's very hard to say I'm inspired completely by psychology. No, not really.
Yeah. You showed that you actually incorporate a lot of knowledge. You store it and you extract it and so on. Does that mean that you also have representations for abstract relationships and organized in concrete representations into a high level?
That's the idea. That's the idea behind the DREAM project. you want to take these first representations, you get into very simple sensorial representations, and start introducing new representation functions that are abstracting from the perceptual and action, final action, let's say, data. And that's what we are doing right now in collaboration with the UPMC and people at the Free University House.
You know, after the coffee break,